All right, the first embarrassing question. Is it Crerar?
Crerar.
Crerar.
Yes, it comes from the Scottish Gaelic creathra, which means sieve wielder, so presumably my family were millers at some point or other.
OK, I think that counts. Too much information. But Pippa, as you all know, is the political editor of The Mirror. She's also the deputy chair of the Press Gallery. You will know her because she's been central to two of the biggest political scandals we've lived through over the last couple of years. Firstly, the eyesight test, and secondly, the suitcase full of wine. She's prior to being at The Mirror, she's worked for The Guardian, The Evening Standard, and I think The Independent.
Lots of organisations over time, but mainly The Guardian, Mirror and Standard.
OK. So, when did you first hear about these parties at Number 10?
So this has sort of sparked a conspiracy theory of its own, but in January 2021, a contact called me up and said, "You'll never guess, I've heard that there was a party a few weeks ago. It was actually told it was at CCHQ and that Boris Johnson was there. And I might want to investigate." And that was all the information I had. It wasn't a direct source, somebody that was at the party. It was sort of third-hand, ultimately. And I spent weeks trying to stand it up, talking to different contacts, trying to get closer to the source, all the things that any journalist would do, and ultimately came up against a brick wall and wasn't able to get it anywhere. But like many of these things, as any journalist in the room will know, quite often you come across tips and allegations that don't amount to a story, and they might never amount to a story, but regardless, you put the little nugget away in your head somewhere and hope that at some point it might be useful. And then if you fast forward 8 or 9 months to October last year, I was talking to somebody completely different about something completely different, and was shown what I've described previously as a metaphorical brown paper envelope, which wasn't a brown paper envelope, but was a bit of evidence that gave me, there wasn't enough to publish a story, but persuaded me to look again at the fact that there'd been gatherings, not just at CCHQ, but in Number 10 and across Whitehall, many of them, and that I should try and find out more. And armed with that and feeling a bit more resilient about it, as a result of that, a bit more confident in it, I went back to original sources, spoke to other people, and gradually, over the next 6 weeks, pieced together this jigsaw of what I felt had happened until we reached a point 6 weeks later, the end of November, 1st of December, that we felt we were able to publish.
That's such a disappointing answer. What I wanted you to say is, yeah, I got all the evidence in January, but I decided to sit on it till Christmas because it would have greater political. But there were people sort of suggesting that sort of.
There's always people suggesting conspiracy theories like that. But I'm afraid that actually the day-to-day business of journalism is very rarely as glamorous as people think, and it is quite sort of pedestrian, hard work, asking questions, speaking to people, piecing stuff together. Much more boring than I think people give us credit for, and you have to be quite diligent. And if you think that you're onto something, and I really did, you have to be prepared to come up against all sorts of brick walls when you're trying to pursue what you think is a story.
I remember that the last conference we did in this venue before lockdown, Sam Coates saying that mobile phones, and particularly screenshots, have changed the world of journalism fundamentally. Were there lots of screenshots involved in your life over the last few months, I imagine?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, the fact that the Met Police has 300 pictures, some of which, of course, are security cameras of people going in and out of Number 10, some of which we revealed a few weeks ago were the official photographers, taxpayer-paid photographers' record of events going on in Number 10, but some of which, of course, we believe were people's own phones, their own photo rolls of events that they took pictures of, that they participated in when they were in Number 10.
And just to be clear, what's the process you go through internally to decide whether, this stacks up, whether there is a substantiable story here? I mean, I imagine it's quite complicated and there are a lot of lawyers involved.
Well, I think ultimately it comes down to both faith in sourcing and a threshold for sourcing. And I've always had quite a high threshold when it comes to publication of something which potentially is quite explosive. I mean, the obvious other example is the Dominic Cummings story. I don't think you can run these stories with a single source unless there's something irrefutable like a picture or on the record testimony.
Yeah.
I think if you're relying on unnamed sources, you have to at least always have a couple, and ideally more if it's a big story. And that was the case with this particular one, that I felt multiple sourcing. There was lots of allegations that we didn't put into that first story. The ones we did were three particular gatherings, including the November 13th one in the Prime Minister's own flat, and also source quotes about the fact that parties were more widespread, sort of inferring that there was more to come. But there was a particular moment you asked about when we decided to publish. Of course, having all the information was the key thing, feeling that it had reached that threshold. My editors or our lawyers, nobody ever knew who any of the sources were. I'm the only person that knows who the sources are, which is right. I mean, that's how journalism should work. My editors obviously have complete faith in me that I trust my sources and I've done my journalistic due diligence. And the lawyers, of course, want to cast their eye over it, but there was never a moment where there was anything, there was a very clear public interest argument in all of this. So throughout all these stories, there's never been a moment where there's been sort of any dispute over that. But going back to when we decided to publish, though, there was a moment where we were sitting, the number 9 Downing Street briefing room is pretty well known now, because it's the one where Allegra Stratton obviously was caught on camera doing that sort of practice briefing, which the story kind of exploded after that. But we were in the briefing room with the Prime Minister's spokesman for one of our regular daily lobby briefings. And that morning, Jenny Harris, the UK HSA chief, had been on the Today programme and done the media round, and she had basically been asked about social gatherings in the run-up to Christmas. This is all set against the backdrop of the fact that Omicron was starting to arrive in the UK, and that COVID was on the front pages again and leading the news bulletins for the first time in many, many months. She was asked about social gatherings at Christmas. She suggested that people should actually be a bit more cautious and perhaps choose carefully about who they met up with. And the Prime Minister's spokesman was very clear that what was not happening was that the government was not saying, he basically slapped her down and said, no, we want people to continue as normal. And I kind of thought, backdrop of COVID, parties are being talked about, all the information is in place, now's the moment to publish.
Yeah. And as you were publishing, did you ever worry that this would just go down as a sort of bubble story, that it wouldn't have resonance? Or were you pretty convinced?
Well, I mean, I think I knew that it would have some impact. Having done the Cummings story the year before and have been told that it was just a bubble story and nobody cared about it, I knew that actually the fact that everybody had a story to tell about what they were doing during lockdown, and in some cases quite dramatic sacrifices were made, I understood that there would be a resonance. But of course, it was a year ago. It was a year before. So, I arrived after publication, I arrived at Westminster that morning, bumped into several people who were kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but it's not going to go anywhere. Or, it's a year old. Is it really going to resonate? And of course, I had those doubts as well. But I did think, nevertheless, despite the time lapse, it was worth getting the story out there. I didn't, for a minute, begin to think that it would result in as many gatherings being revealed, or indeed an internal civil service report, or indeed a police investigation and the Prime Minister himself being under investigation. These things kind of have spiralled over time. But, quite often, we particularly on the Mirror, because we're very focused on covering politics from outside the bubble rather than necessarily the sort of the machinations of internal party politics. And like I say, having been through the Cummings story experience previously, I did think that it would touch a nerve with lots of people. What I don't think I realised is actually that for a lot of people, those issues were still incredibly pertinent and very close to the surface, and it would bubble over so quickly.
And do you think it resonated more because stuff was dribbled out over time?
Well, I think it's prolonged the whole process, but I think that's in part because of the government's initial reaction to it. And what I've noticed with this particular government is that there has been a tendency in response to all sorts of questions, not just about the ones that I've covered that are more high profile, but on a daily basis, there's been lots of questions about lots of questions have been met with sort of stonewalling or obfuscation or denial, and that comes from the very top. And that's always, I covered Boris Johnson for his whole term, 2 terms in London as mayor when I was on the Evening Standard, and obviously the Evening Standard is a much sort of friendlier paper towards Boris Johnson than the Mirror is now. But there is definitely a sort of a pattern to the way he responds to difficult stories and controversies. He always has doubled down, toughened it out, thought he'd toughen it out, and hope it all goes away. And I've seen that replicated so many times over the years, and that is very much led. That sort of media strategy has been led by the top.
And do you think there's more to come? I mean, do you know there's more to come, is what I would ask.
If you mean, do I have more? I mean, I've heard, like many people, lots of allegations.
Yeah.
But allegations and something becoming a story, as I said, I've got a very high threshold for publication. Something like this, you can't take a risk on it being wrong. Then we'll have to wait and see. But one thing about this story which has really struck me is that how it's moved in sort of ebbs and flows. So before Christmas and the run up to Christmas, when people were worried about potential restrictions on their own lives again over Christmas, it brought it all back to people. And then over Christmas itself, it kind of went away for 10 days or more, a couple of weeks. And then we had that day when Dominic Cummings put out a blog saying, well, look, there was this party in the garden, the Bring Your Own Booze party, on June I'm forgetting all the dates now, June the 20th, 2020, was it?
Don't ask me about dates.
May the 20th, 2020. And the whole thing kind of kicked off again.
Yeah.
And again, there are much more pertinent issues. There's like really, obviously, the urgency of the Ukraine situation. There's the COVID changes, which the Prime Minister announced yesterday. I think many people across the country are much more concerned about, rightly, about the cost of living crisis over the next couple of months.
Yep.
But there are a couple of danger points ahead for the Prime Minister, and they include, I think they're in the next few weeks, and they include the response, the police response, whether they decide to fine him or not, and then what Conservative MPs do about that. And they include the publication of the full Sue Gray inquiry, which may or may not show that he misled Parliament, which obviously many people feel is a resigning matter. I think if he gets through those, then he's perhaps on firmer ground.
Now, I mean, you spend your life talking to politicians. What is the sort of consensus opinion? Do people now think the Prime Minister is going to survive, or are all bets off?
I think it's really interesting because I watched that statement in the Commons yesterday, as I'm sure many of you did, where you had Tory MP after Tory MP, including, crucially, some on the right of the party who have been most critical, most vocal about Boris Johnson's authority and leadership in recent months, stand up and praise him for taking this action. And, this has been a long time coming. I'm not going to sort of go down the route of suggesting that he's only announced changes to COVID rules because to distract attention from partygate or indeed to give red meat to his MPs. However, it does have the sort of the side effect, if you like, of keeping a lot of his Tory MPs happy. But afterwards, I spoke to quite a few of them just to say, well, look, it sounds as though you're happy with what's happening, and maybe this is the sort of the change in direction you were looking for. And to a man and woman, they said, we're still waiting. We're waiting to see what the police inquiry says, and we're waiting to see what the Sue Gray report says. So the Prime Minister has absolutely bought himself some time, and he and his allies are really trying to shore up his support. And in many areas, I think that will work. But worst case scenario, if the police come back and fine him, and if people are angry about that, if he tries to wriggle out of it or, dismiss it as in the way he has done previously, then I think he remains in a perilous position with his own backbenchers.
I mean, this is a really unfair question, and there probably isn't a decent answer to it. But I mean, assume he does survive and leads the Conservatives into the next election. Do you think this story has legs? Do you think it's usable and will have traction for the Labour Party in the next election campaign in a year or two's time? So
what I would do is separate myself from the politics of it. I mean, it's up to the Labour Party what they do, and you can only imagine that they would look at Boris Johnson's whole record over his time in office. What I can comment on is what I hear from our readers and the impact that it clearly has had. The polls show that it's had an impact. MPs of all parties that you talk to suggest that they've had a huge response from their constituents about it. And I think what it has done inevitably is damage the Prime Minister's standing in terms of his integrity. Now, I think a lot of people voted for Boris Johnson and knew exactly who they were voting for and what they were voting for, and either they didn't mind that he's always had this kind of slightly elastic relationship with the truth, or they cared more about other things like getting Brexit done or not having Jeremy Corbyn in power or whatever else their reasons were. This time round, I think that they will, and there'll be people more qualified than I to comment on this, but I think that while they will still obviously be voting depending on who they think will best change their lives for the better, I think that the sort of overwhelming support that you saw for Boris Johnson and his character, or that we interpreted as a very personal mandate, a very sort of personal vote for him, as much for the Conservative parties generally, I think it's inevitable that that will have been damaged by this whole process.
And I can't miss the opportunity for a plug, but in this report, which is fantastic, if you want, two of the interesting nuggets that sort of feed into what Pippa was saying is, firstly, the Leave voters who are deserting Boris Johnson at the moment is quite striking. And secondly, if you look at the section on COVID, the disalignment between where people place themselves in terms of support or otherwise for COVID measures and how they see the Tory government is quite striking. So. You know, it might well be that has real resonance going forward. Now, as I said, this is not the first, but the second sort of scandal you've presided over, if I can put it that way. Did the whole Dominic Cummings affair make it easier for you, sort of on a personal level, to know what to expect this time round? Or was it a bit of a dry run for this in terms of being at the centre of a national political storm?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've covered lots of big stories in my time and brought in exclusives in my time, but never on the scale of the Cummings story. And I think because everybody, you know, we were still in lockdown at that point, so that had particular resonance for people. I learned a huge amount from it, not least how to put a story together like this, the whole sort of threshold point. I mean, we went over and beyond with that particular one because we were faced by denials from Cummings and from Number 10. And it gave me a really interesting insight into how politicians and political figures respond to these types of stories and how you can interpret those responses, whether it's sort of, you know, flat out denials, whether people talk to you on background, whether it's sort of public dismissals, you know, the whole spectrum. And of course that experience can only be a good thing. It kind of gives you confidence that you're onto something. I think it also underlined to me that, of course, while everything, you do your journalistic due diligence and check and recheck and check again, it gave me faith that my instincts that I was onto something should be listened to. Even if people are telling you it's not relevant, it's old, it didn't happen. You know, if you trust your sources and if your instinct is that something is right, then you should pursue it.
Just out of interest, what were you thinking when you watched that press conference he did in the Garden?
Oh my God, it was awful. It was so we were one of the organisations. We had this rota system that different news for newspapers, not for broadcasters. That you know, a few people could go and ask questions at all these, or remotely at these Number 10 press conferences. And the Mirror got one of the questions that day, but it was a bank holiday Monday, and I was at home with the kids, and I didn't have anywhere. You know, we were given like an hour's notice to get there, and given it was still during lockdown, I mean, they're too young to like abandon at home, so I couldn't go myself. So one of my colleagues went and, you know, did a great job asking questions, but it was the most surreal moment, and there was also, you know, sitting there watching, sort of hidden away upstairs in my house, watching it all unfold and not being able to obviously ask questions myself. It was really hard. Yeah. And the reporters weren't allowed to take phones in, which was strange because, you know, previously and since we have been allowed to take phones into Number 10. So we couldn't even sort of text lines to my colleague. But journalists, including Jason Groves at the Mail and Nicola, who used to work for me at the Mirror, and others, you know, did a great job of sort of pinning him down. And well, you'll have seen him sort of getting into sort of more and more convoluted responses. But it felt a very strange and actually uncomfortable situation, not least because your great fear, despite all your, you know, your double checking and all the rest of it, is that you've got something wrong and, you know, they're going to sit there and you know, you feel slightly sick. And the same thing happened that first Wednesday PMQs when Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer stood up. I made two of my team come and sit either side of me just for moral support in case Boris Johnson, despite us going to Number 10 and them knowing exactly what we were publishing beforehand, in case he turned around with some sort of, you know, killer fact that proved it was all wrong. Of course, you're always terrified that it might fall apart despite all your journalistic due diligence to make sure that it doesn't.
You made your kids sit through the whole thing?
They didn't watch it.
All right.
I don't think they're very interested in politics.
This is the question I really want an answer to out of all of them. Have you spoken to Dominic Cummings since?
No. And this is something that always fascinates me, is that people think that this whole party story is some, master plan that he's orchestrating. And presumably, if he's feeding people information, I would be amongst those people. But I can absolutely state categorically that we've had. I have spoken to him in the past, but I haven't spoken to him since any of this. I have sent him a few text messages to see if he would talk to me about stuff. Completely ignored. So I think I would be the last person that he would want to speak to. So I'm afraid if it ruins the sort of thesis that this is a great orchestrated campaign. Majority of my sources are, well, they're all different for a start. And their motivations are not sort of, to single-handedly bring down the Prime Minister.
Okay. I mean, on the surface, it is utterly bizarre, isn't it, that you have this series of parties involving loads of people, and we don't hear anything about it for a year. I mean, how did that manage to go unnoticed for so long?
I think it was sort of bunker mentality, wasn't it? Number 10 and the Cabinet Office were two of the few places in the country where it wasn't business as usual. It was business as very unusual. But in terms of people being in the building, they were all there. They worked very long hours. And they were dealing with some of the most, awful things that our country has been through. So I think people got into this, certainly from people I've spoken to now, say that they got into this bunker mentality, and it didn't start off. It didn't really happen during that first lockdown. It was only really into the summer, and then obviously the run up to Christmas last year and beyond, second lockdown, where it sort of took off. And it started with a couple of drinks at the desk, then towards the end of the working day, and then it sort of escalated from there. But I've been very careful throughout that we haven't written stories about people having a bottle of wine with a few colleagues at the desks at the end of the working day, because I kind of think that's a grey area. And frankly, I mean, I don't suppose it was happening in the NHS or in schools or in other places where people were going to work. But I think all of us can understand that in a high-pressure workplace environment where you're there for long hours anyway, you might want a glass of wine on your desk. So we've been very careful to distinguish between those sorts of things, which I've ignored, frankly, and events which were purely social, which were planned in advance, where alcohol was present, where the Prime Minister was present, obviously at some of them, and that no work at all was done. And I think that distinction is really important. This isn't us just saying, being sort of very anti having a drink at work. I mean, I've done that. I'm sure you've done that. I'm sure everyone in the room has done that.
Absolutely not.
Maybe not during lockdown.
Ever.
But yes, I think people got into this sort of bunker mentality. And then there is definitely, I was told for that very first story, that Boris Johnson was either aware of what was going on, in that he, either participated or witnessed it, or he turned a blind eye to it. And these things, culture is inevitably led by the top, from the top.
I mean, it strikes me you're being very charitable in the sense that, on some of these occasions at least, the people involved had either done or watched press conferences where they or their colleagues had said, here is a list of things you can't do, including what I'm about to do.
Yeah.
I mean...
Well, that's why the public's so angry about it.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure people can reach their own conclusions as to whether it was appropriate behaviour or not. That's not, for me to say. I was just very conscious that there was a real public interest argument in the fact that, precisely as you say, I know it's become almost like a hackneyed phrase now, there's one rule for us, one rule for everyone else. But that, more than anything, gets to the heart of, I think, why people felt so angry about it. So many people did predominantly abide by really quite stringent restrictions on their own lives, and yet the very people that were asking them to do that weren't prepared to do the same.
Now we get to the bit where I blame journalists for everything that's going on.
It's all our fault.
Is one of the problems, one of the reasons why this took so long to emerge, because there's an unhealthy kind of chumminess between some people in the lobby and people in Number 10. I mean, it transpires that line is quite a blurred one.
There are people in the lobby that are friends with people in Number 10, but this whole sort of, this story didn't come out because half the lobby was at these parties. I mean, as far as I can make out, only people that, and I'm not talking about the Prime Minister's flat, I'm talking about in the offices in Westminster, it was only people that had sort of legitimate reason to be in the building anyway during lockdown that were involved. I'm not, I can't speak for every individual. I would be surprised if colleagues on even government-supporting newspapers had the level of information that I had and didn't do something about it. And I know that doesn't fit with the comfortable narrative of, they were protecting what was going on at Number 10. I mean, it's astonishing that people didn't know about it. But I know lots and lots of people at Number 10, and I didn't know about it. And maybe, so maybe the fault is with us, with not sort of being able to come across or uncover these events sooner. But I don't think there was some massive cover-up.
Okay. I mean, do you think, and don't answer if you feel uncomfortable talking about this, I mean, there is a problem of excessive closeness between some journalists and politicians, and that sort of...
I think there's a couple of things. I think that there has to be a distinction between you have to be clear about who you describe as a journalist, because I think reporting and being a columnist, for example, is very different.
Yeah.
I mean, you have somebody like Danny Finkelstein, incredible columnist, very close friend of David Cameron, was going in there every week and having Cameron's memoirs sort of recited to him. Obviously very, very close, but he was a columnist. He wasn't reporting, particularly wasn't broadcasting, where obviously there's the expectation of impartiality. So I think, that's fine. I think the issue is for reporters who are, regardless of their, it's a bit more muddied when it comes to newspapers, obviously, because each newspaper has its own editorial position. It's less muddied for broadcasters. But of course, people will have relationships with people in government. I mean, my husband's a civil servant, but I think the big difference doesn't work in Number 10, by the way. I think the big difference is that you're professional about it. And, I look at colleagues, and some of whom are, have had romantic relationships with people in Number 10, who are old friends, predating ever arriving in politics or journalism, who have relationships. I mean, that's life, isn't it? We all work in the same world, but are able to have a clear distinction about what's talked about and what's not. And I certainly have it in my own home. I mean, however much I might try and plug my husband for information about his department, I get very little out of him.
Right.
So, you'd hope that others working for government are equally as stringent about what, and careful about what they say. I'm not, I don't want to be naive about it. Clearly, there's lots of conversations that go on.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that journalists do have to watch out for.
Are there any MPs that you consider to be friends?
There's lots of MPs that I like on both sides of the political divide, and lots of people that I would happily have a beer with or go out for dinner with, but I'm quite church and state about it. There's no politicians I would invite to my house. I've not been invited to a politician's house. I wouldn't, my friends are people I went to university with, my school mum pals, people I went to school with. You can be very friendly, but there's a difference between being friendly and being a friend.
Okay. And have you ever been asked to go and work for one of those politicians?
As I said to you earlier, Anand, I've actually been asked over the years to go and work for politicians of both of the main parties, so I'm not sure what that says about me. I wouldn't tell you who, and obviously I said no.
Have you ever been tempted? Would you see a problem with that?
I think that, for me anyway, I very strongly feel that I'm a journalist and I'm not a party political supporter. So whoever I work for, whether that's the Conservative supporting Evening Standard or the Labour supporting Daily Mirror, my responsibilities first and foremost, and my interest and what drives me is journalism, not the sort of the editorial line or indeed the party political line of any party. So for me, I think I would find it quite an uncomfortable move to go into the world of politics. But everybody has different priorities and different views, and I'm not going to judge colleagues who have taken a different decision. I mean, the allure of working in Number 10 or for one of the one of the cabinet or indeed the opposition must be very strong for those of us that work in this world and sort of rub shoulders with power.
Yeah. Can I just say, for those of you who are submitting questions, a lot of the questions on here are sort of generic Brexit and politics questions, which we can come to during the day. But for this session, if you've got questions to Pippa, write questions specifically to Pippa and we'll try and go through them. Otherwise, a lot of this stuff seems sort of generic about the stuff we're going to be talking about today and addressing in later sessions. It must have been totally weird to be a journalist during lockdown.
It was very strong. It was weird to be in anything during lockdown, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, like everybody else, particularly that first lockdown, none of us quite knew what was happening. I was at home with 3 school-aged children, young primary school children. So we're sort of navigating the whole homeschooling thing. Both my husband and I were working. It was very strange, not least because so much of my job is based on conversations with people, with politicians. You know, you wander down the corridor to get a cup of coffee in Portcullis House, you bump into 3 politicians and have a wee chat. Well, gossiping by appointment is much harder, I'll tell you. You can call people up for a chat, but they won't necessarily be as forthcoming as if you've just bumped into them. And then we had the whole thing about, and this is less about my Mirror role and more about I was press gallery chair for that first year, about that role. It's working out how we collectively held the government to account in the lobby was really difficult, because we had these press conferences, daily press conferences, and the newspapers, the broadcasters number 10 made decisions on who would ask questions, but we decided collectively in the lobby that we would set up a rota. And actually, historically, you go along to these press conferences and a minister would take maybe 4 or 5 questions, and they would predominantly be from friendly newspapers. So it felt a much more democratic system, and everybody got, we hope, including regionals and specialist publications, we made sure that everybody got a bite at the cherry, if you like. And it didn't matter whether you were asking Prime Minister Rishi Sunak or Matt Hancock or somebody else. Yeah. It was done on a rota. But setting that up and trying to kind of defend the system, particularly in those first few weeks of the pandemic when Parliament wasn't sitting, the recess was extended, and it almost felt, for all the criticism we collectively got for not holding the government to account appropriately, I do think that we're working in absolutely uncharted territory, and not least because Parliament wasn't sitting, so it almost felt we were the only ones that were there and able to hold the government to account in those early days when we were all navigating our way. There's lots that we could have done better, of course, but we were all navigating our way through this new world. So, all of that combined with sort of, doing your job in a completely different way, plus the pressures of domestic life. Yeah. It was like, as for many, many people, it was a very, very strange time.
I mean, that whole homeschooling thing did my head in. I mean, our kids are all grown up, but our neighbours have got 3 school-age kids, and the one thing that kept me going through lockdown was watching their gradual decline. Actually, it made me feel so much better. It made my lockdown so much more enjoyable. So I make it that you're now followed by about 1/3 of a million people on Twitter. You've become a sort of celebrity.
Say that.
And your profile has risen massively. Has that affected your ability to do your job? Has that changed things for you?
I think, yes. In some ways, it opens doors because people see that you've got a record of writing stories and which have a particular impact. They also see that you protect your sources. And they see that you're somebody that they can bring a bit of information to, which is not necessarily sort of, fully formed bit of information, a bit of a tip maybe, that you might be able to do something with it. So from that point of view, yes, of course, it's been a big help. It also means that politicians, particularly Tory politicians who don't know me, are much more cautious about speaking to me because they think I'm about to turn them over or something like that, which is just not the case. Fortunately, because I worked at the Standard for so long and have been covering politics since the early noughties, I know lots of people from right across the political divide that will base their judgment of me based on knowing me rather than, sort of stories of the last 2 years. I mean, that's the way Westminster works. It's all built on relationships. But yes, there are people, I'm sure, that will see me walking down the corridor and would turn around and walk away. And in terms of the profile, I mean, I guess it's given me a very tiny insight into what it is like to be somebody much more high profile, whether it's in journalism or elsewhere, and how difficult a path that can be to navigate in terms of keeping your own life private and protecting the people, less about. So Twitter is being a perfect example. Yeah. I get lots of supportive remarks on Twitter, but I also get a lot of abuse. I think women generally in politics do get more than their fair share. Not there's no fair share, but you know what I mean. a long time ago, I was given advice by Laura Kuenssberg, in fact, not to look at my notifications. You can do a little switch so that you don't automatically see what people say to you. You can still go in and read the responses should you want to. And of course, the downside of that is that you miss out on all sorts of comments and constructive comments and engagement. But the upside is that you don't see the abuse. The problem is that your family, for example, can still see that abuse. So I get regular calls from my parents saying, after I've written a particular story, who've obviously gone onto my Twitter feed and read what people have said about it. And while there are a lot of supportive comments, there are also some very personal and abusive ones. And will come up and say, "Oh, are you okay, darling?" And, I worry about you, as any parent would. And I have to say to them, look, I don't see it, so don't worry about me. Don't you look at it either. It doesn't do anyone any good. My husband, fortunately, isn't on social media and doesn't give two hoots about these things. So, and the kids are great levelers. But it's, I've in a tiny level compared to the likes of Laura Kuenssberg or Beth Rigby or any of the TV presenters. But it's not a comfortable insight. I'll put it that way.
Well, it's almost sort of becoming the story to an extent, isn't it, rather than writing the story? That's the sort of difference.
Well, I think that separation is really important. And there's a real difference between how when I first started off writing political journalism in sort of 2002, I think my first job at Westminster was, people would go down the pub and would critique your story, and possibly you, but you'd never know about it. Now that's all done online. Yeah. And not only is it done online, it's often done anonymously. And I know for a fact, sometimes I look at the people that are trolling me. Once in a blue moon, I'm curious and have a look, and I'll go onto their sites and see what sort of things that they say generally. And, of course, there are some who are just out to attack anybody, but lots of them are people that, just have a particular worldview and, love their kids and their dog and are concerned about their local town and whatever else. But because they never need to say anything, and I know for a fact would never say what they say online to my face, and that makes me feel better about it. It's just a sort of an angry moment. It's an easy hit. It makes them feel better. But generally, I try and avoid them because what's the point in subjecting yourself to that, frankly?
Well, if there's one thing that's sad, it's that dog lovers can be trolls at the same time.
Oh, I know.
So I think that's all wrong. So, on balance, if you sort of step back from it, do you think Twitter has been good or bad for politics and political debate? It's a massive question, I know.
Oh, God. It sounds like a politician's answer, but a bit of both, I think. It's great in terms of engaging with audiences and profile and getting your stories out there, and adding, you can add fantastic context to stories that you've written that you wouldn't necessarily put in print or include in a TV package. And you can engage with people, and I think that is all useful. There are days where there's a huge amount of humour on Twitter, and I love that. And I love people's dog pics as well. I'm a dog owner. I love people's dogs of Twitter is my favourite thing. But of course, our politics is divisive or polarised anyway at the moment. Yeah. And I think Twitter, and it's chicken and egg, which came first, but I think Twitter makes that worse. People tend to sort of, depending on who you follow, you're potentially in an echo chamber. And people sort of drive each other on, and because of the relative anonymity, it doesn't foster necessarily good debate or honest debate. And I think there are major problems with that. I think Twitter needs to sort out the abuse thing for starters. Yeah. But I think we all need to be aware of its limitations, despite the fact that it can be a very useful tool for journalism.
I suppose an inbuilt advantage you have over broadcast journalists is you're not stuck in a studio, so you get out and about, so you get more of a sense of perspective that actually Twitter isn't the world or the country. And
yeah, well, broadcast studio, okay, maybe if you're a presenter it's a bit different, but broadcast journalists get out and about a lot. I think it's really important to remember, David Cameron was quite right. Maybe he was a bit rude about the terms he used, I won't repeat, but Twitter is not the real world, and it's really important to be able to turn it off and go and talk to real people. And real people, like me, sound like I'm not a real person. Of course I'm a real person too. Ordinary people, maybe as people outside of politics, is probably a better way of putting it. It has its place and its role, and it can be helpful, but I think we need to be aware of the limitations and the fact that it isn't the real world.
Now, you talked about the fact that women get a lot of abuse on social media. How has being a woman in the lobby changed in the time you've been there, if it has?
Well, no, it definitely has. When I first started out, there were a few women political editors, or senior women, a handful of them. And there are a handful now. There's currently, I think, 7 women political editors of different news organisations. The difference is that most of us now have families as well, whereas not one of the women political editors when I started off had kids. And that's the big difference. And the fact that there are dads in the lobby, political editors and others, who play a very active role in their children's lives, you know, will leave work at a certain time to pick them up from nursery and then return to their desk when they get home, or have taken parental leave of several months. You know, it's incremental changes, but I think that changes things predominantly. It's a different generation in Westminster now, and while maybe we're behind other parts of the world, you know, there's still not enough senior women. The balance is still skewed. There's also, you know, if you look at, there is still also a thing of that gender-wise it's quite balanced up until the point that people become childbearing. That's something I've noticed, and then it's sort of, the balance shifts a bit. But the lobby is still hideously white, and that's, I think, you know, the next major challenge for people recruiting in politics. It's very public school.
It's Southern Metropolitan.
Says the Scot. It's more mixed. It's definitely more mixed than when I started.
Right.
Although, interestingly, it's packed with graduates now. And when I started, lots of journalists weren't graduates. They got, you know, they left school and they got a job in their local paper and worked their way up from there. So there are definitely differences in that respect as well.
I mean, actually, if you look at the section in the report on MPs, it's really fascinating, because on the one hand, MPs have become far more diverse in terms of gender, sexuality, etc. But in terms of levels of education and previous occupation, they've become even more homogenous than they were before. So we worry about certain sorts of diversity and not others. Now, I think Ollie's just told me I need to bring this to a close, which is a tribute to you, because actually this feels like sitting at home and having a chat, and I've completely lost. However, there's one thing I have to do, because I've got a question here from a bloke called John Curtis, and if it is him, and I don't ask it, then my life won't be worth living. So, have the media provided as good coverage of the consequences of Brexit as they have of partygate?
That is a very good question, isn't it?
Sorry to spring that on you.
No, that's fine. No, in a word. I think that there's several things going on here. I think one is decisions by editors about what they think that their readers want, or their viewers want to see or to read. And I think one of the reasons that the Get Brexit Done slogan was so pertinent, even though Brexit will never be done, it's, you know, the future relationship goes on and on and on, was that people were frankly getting a bit fed up with talking about Brexit and it dominating our political life. And we really got into the weeds. I mean, 2018, 2019, 2020, really got into the weeds of Brexit. And I think we, the media, and I think that the public appetite for reading very sort of technical stories about Brexit is gone, and I think editors recognise that. However, and then the second thing I'd say is that the whole debate about whether the will of the people has been delivered, whether that means that the very large number of people that didn't want to leave the EU should now shut up about it, has become quite, was initially and has continued to be quite toxic. And I think there's particularly because Brexit was such a big issue at the 2019 election, I think there was, among many people in the Labour Party in particular, a sort of a tendency to shy away from talking about it, not wanting to give the government any opportunity to kind of beat them over the head about it and say, oh, you're a bunch of Remainers, you wanted to deny the will of the people and all that sort of thing. And because newspapers anyway, the majority of papers are pro-government, I think that has had an impact on coverage. So the two things, people being bored with it and people, and sort of being an editorial assumption that, that you know, it's settled now, and if you question or challenge you're in some way kind of undermining the public's decision,
have
both caused problems. I mean, there are notable exceptions, of course, and it does feel a little bit to me like the way to deal with it is to look at the specifics when they happen. So to look at, supply chain issues, to look at, the queues at Dover, to look at food prices, obviously to look at Northern Ireland and the protocol and the issues around the border, and to focus on each individual aspect rather than trying to sort of rewrite or sort of, to take the broader view. Because ultimately, as with the initial Brexit debate, there are polarised views on either end. The vast majority of people just want the facts and to be able to make up their own minds. So I think we are not doing enough of that at the moment, and we all need to be bolder in doing that and addressing those issues. But I think as time goes on, that will get easier.
So the goalposts do keep moving. I mean, I did a debate the other day with someone who was utterly bewildered when the opening gambit from my opponent was that Boris Johnson has betrayed Brexit by being a sort of pseudo-Remainer.
Oh, right.
And so
because he wrote those 2 articles and didn't actually.
Well, no, because he's compromising with the EU. So,
right.
Anyway, the top tip from this session is if you want your question to be asked, then log in as John Curtis. We're too scared to ignore you. But for the moment, Pippa, thank you ever so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.